Great. So I'm here to introduce Dr. Tim Horner. He is a professor in the theology department as well as ACS and Peace and Justice. So he's teaching not only some ACS classes this fall, but a Peace and Justice theology class called The Dilemma of Genocide. He's also teaching it next semester as well. If any of you are interested and would like to take your upper level theology class, it's really great. Dr. Horner also wanted to plug the Summer Study Abroad program in Rwanda. It'll be about 2 to 3 weeks, I believe, right? 3 weeks. So there will be some educational components as well as a lot of just community time to learn about what has happened in Rwanda. Dr. Horner has been to Rwanda twice already and has presented a paper there. So he has a lot of experience and a lot of research and knowledge, and we're very excited to have him tonight. Anything else?
Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Horner.
Thanks very much for coming out. It's great. That's really nice. It's nice to see such interest in this on campus. The group has been growing over the last couple of years. I know Beth and her cohorts have been working really hard to make Stand a part, kind of a permanent part of Villanova and the kind of the way we see ourselves in the world. And so I've been really impressed with the kind of work that they've done and to bring kind of genocide up into the forefront of kind of who we are as a school and a people, and so I'm happy to be here tonight, and thank you for coming. So I'm going to do something which is slightly, I toyed with the idea of doing something that was like user-friendly and lots of bells and whistles and pictures and oohs and ahs. I decided not to do that. I decided to go with something that is a little edgier, something that I have been working on. This is my research. I'm going to look like a talking head tonight, and I don't usually like to do that. When I teach, I like to move around. I like to engage and do this, but I'm not going to do that tonight. I'm doing this on purpose because I want to try to let you in on the kinds of stuff that I'm working on, the stuff especially with understanding Darfur and Rwanda and what it means to be American and what it means to kind of understand genocide in a context. So I'm erring on the side of treating you like I would treat my fellow academics. I'm hoping that this will engage you on a different kind of level, and that I'm not going to be just dry and dusty and that kind of stuff. But I'm asking for you guys to kind of to walk with me on this walk. This is where I'm at. This is I feel like I'm on the verge of trying to do something that is really productive and add to the conversation. And so this is where I'm at with my work. And so I'm going to be reading off a page, which is going to be tough. It's tough. It's kind of boring looking, and I realize that because I've sat through lots of papers, trust me. And they can be, so I'm asking for your indulgence is what I'm asking for. So I'm just going to try to make this as engaging as I can. And hopefully we'll have a time. I think I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes. I'm going to try to keep it down to 30 minutes, and then I'll have a time, hopefully if you have any questions or comments, that we can open up the floor. I really would like to be able to hear what you guys think of this and how you react to it. So that's a big part of what I do. I learn a lot in my research by what happens in my classroom and what happens with my students and what they think, and so that's an important part of what I do. All right. I also just got new glasses, so this is weird. I'm now of the age where I have progressive lenses, which is freaking me out because I know I'm going to die now. But so I'm kind of still getting used to like looking down and everything gets big, and so bear with me. I'm like it's very troubling how old I'm getting. All right. As an American, I carry the burden of our national apathy. In 1994, I was old enough to have known better. In the late 80s and 90s, I was a young father to a growing family, and my concerns were for my career and future. I was finishing up seminary and preparing to move to England to begin my doctoral work on the history of Christianity and its unholy relationship to Judaism. The horrors of the Holocaust had sparked my academic interest, and I was committed to try to understand how 6 million Jews could have been systematically killed by a government while, with few exceptions, the Church and America stood by and watched. In early 1994, so much attention was focused on apartheid in South Africa and then the debacle in Somalia. It is painful and embarrassing that I can remember only the slightest fragment of information about Rwanda from the spring and summer of 1994. Like so many Americans, we watched the clips and shook our heads. Something bad had happened in Africa, again. As I try to account for my own selfishness, I realize that in many ways I am the embodiment of America's inaction. I'm not the only one who feels like this. Susan Rice, Obama's new ambassador to the UN and part of the Clinton administration in 1994, said recently that the failure of America even to consider immediate action in Rwanda has shaped her outlook in diplomacy. Quote, "I swore to myself that if I ever faced such a crisis again, I would come down on the side of dramatic action, going down in flames if that was required." 15 years later, and we are still plagued by the question, what have we learned from the 1994 genocide of the Tutsi and moderate Hutu? When I ask it, I feel like a consumer of the genocide, poking around in the facts of history, looking for something I can take away and use for my own purposes. The question implies two things. One, that there is something to learn, and two, that there is a possibility of somehow preventing a future genocide. There are so many ways in which Rwanda's genocide is unique and puzzling that one wonders if the lessons learned could have any kind of general use. What do we learn from seeing neighbors killing neighbors, husbands killing wives, people killing children, and women suffering the most extreme forms of dehumanization at the hands of young men drunk on banana beer and adrenaline? Maybe we only learn that given the right combination of fear, intimidation, isolation, and misinformation, people, any people, are capable of the most extreme acts of violence and degradation. What do we learn from tracking the movements of the Hutu extremist groups in the months and even years leading up to the genocide? We might conclude that a small group of unscrupulous power mongers can mobilize hundreds of thousands of people to commit murder on command. What do we learn from looking at the international community, America and the UN, and its frozen stare of horror as it watched an entire country descend into nightmare? We might learn that unless there is direct economic consequence to inaction, we should expect nothing more than a heartfelt, after-the-fact apology. These lessons may very well be true, but they are cold. They reveal the weakness of a populace and the malice of the people who govern them. Knowing these sobering characteristics may urge us to take nothing for granted and assume that in any given situation, people and governments will do whatever they can to steal and hoard power unless they are stopped by force. There are those who would believe that this is how we should conduct our foreign policy. Assume the worst and act swiftly and militarily to quash any whiff of a possibility of a threat. But suspicions at this level are corrosive to society and can become self-fulfilling prophecies. The other reaction to this extremely suspicious view of human nature is a kind of denial. Even though the world still had the words "never again" ringing in its ears from World War II, and even after the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, we still seem to think that it could not happen in Rwanda. Some inside the country, though, could see it coming for decades. But there was always a kind of undercurrent that someone, somewhere, would stop it before it got too far. Is that not why UNAMIR, the United Nations assistance mission in Rwanda, and the Belgian army was there? To keep peace. We in the West thought, conveniently, that the presence of UNAMIR and the UN would be sufficient deterrent to any extremist groups. But looking back, we can see that so many people were so wrong on so many levels that it is almost not worth listing everything that went wrong. But for something so atrocious, we must continue to replay and review and scrutinize despite our discomfort. One lesson that many Americans seem to have learned was that we were too slow to label the killing a genocide. We dragged our feet for weeks as the killing went on until we were compelled to declare that Rwanda was the site of a bona fide genocide. And what was the effect of that declaration? Nothing. It was too late. Certainly in the years after, Rwanda has received a level of support from the American government that few African countries, really no African countries, enjoy. I believe that support stems partly from our collective guilt. It is a legitimate guilt, but it may be distracting us from deeper insights into the causes of genocide. And this hits on a very curious phenomenon in American politics surrounding the word genocide. The way it has been used both for Rwanda and now for Darfur in the Sudan seems to indicate that we believe this word to have magical powers. As soon as we declare something to be genocidal, we assume that it will trigger a massive intervention that will stop the genocide from moving even one more inch forward. In the case of Rwanda, America hesitated to use the word, and by the time we came to acknowledge what was happening in Rwanda, it was too late. The problem, some believe, was that we should have used the word sooner. If we had recognized that it was genocide, then we would have acted more quickly and perhaps averted the staggering loss of life and dignity, or so we assume. But then there was Darfur. On July 22, 2004, the United States Senate and House of Representatives passed a joint resolution declaring the armed conflict of the Sudanese region of Darfur to be genocide, and that called on the Bush administration to lead an international effort to put a stop to it. A few months later, it was again declared a genocide by the United States Secretary of State Colin Powell in testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. America had now used the word it should have used in Rwanda. This should have begun a chain of events leading directly to counter-genocidal action in Darfur. But there was nothing. The following March of 2005, the UN Security Council authorized the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to investigate Sudan on charges of crimes against humanity, war crimes, but expressly not on genocide, since they could find no evidence of a genocidal agenda. In an ironic solidarity with China, Sudan's largest trading partner and ally, the U.S. abstained from voting on the measure. It is easy to see why China abstained because of its vested interest in the sale of arms and access to Sudan's oil and natural resources. But it appears that the U.S. abstained because the Council would not include the word genocide. So then the U.S. found itself alone in the world. But it appears that the U.S. abstained because, with only a few exceptions, French Foreign Minister Philippe Douste-Blazy used the word on the 6th of September of 2006, and it also appeared in a Socialist Party publication in Portugal. But except for these two, all of the references to genocide in Darfur have come from the American government, and the U.S.-based NGOs too numerous to mention. The rest of the international community, including the United Nations, the African Union, Amnesty International, and Médecins Sans Frontières, have rejected the term genocide to describe what is happening in the Darfur region. That was in 2005, 2006. But here in the States, there is a great deal of confusion about this. America seems to be making an effort to change its language away from genocide. On Monday, this Monday, 19th of October, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made a statement which used the word genocide, but in a brand new way. Quote, "Our focus is on reversing the ongoing dire human consequences of genocide by addressing the daily suffering in the refugee camps, protecting civilians from continuing violence, helping displaced persons return to their homes, ensuring that the militias are disarmed, and improving conditions on the ground so that the people of Darfur can finally live in peace and security." This seems to imply that genocide is a thing of the past. But just minutes later, Susan Rice, Washington's U.S. ambassador, said that America's goal is, quote, "to end the genocide that's taking place in Darfur and to forge lasting peace for the Darfuris." Special Envoy to Darfur, which was the third member of this briefing, which happened on Monday, retired General Scott Gratian, also gave a statement at the briefing. He has spent more time in this region than Rice and Clinton combined and multiplied by 10. But he did not use the word once in his statements and has gone on record in stating that he believes the genocide to be over in that region, even though he continues to stress the need for international attention because of continued violence and a massive problem of displaced persons that runs into the millions. It is also worth noting that the highly contentious ICC arrest warrant against Sudan's President al-Bashir did not name genocide as one of the charges. But we in America seem to be committed to see genocide despite the perspective of the rest of the world. And this, I would contend, is what stands in the way of progress in that region. It continues to be a puzzle to the American people. We routinely use the word genocide to refer to the conflict in Sudan, and yet there's nothing being done to stop it. The magic word that we waited too long to use in Rwanda has now shown itself to be powerless in the case of Darfur. Why? Didn't we learn our lesson in Rwanda? And this is a semantic gap between the real world of international politics and the sometimes imagined world of American foreign policy, where we get into the insight into what the real lesson of Rwanda might be, at least for us Americans. And this brings me to the crux of my thesis, which is universal in some sense, but distinctly American in its intensity. I call it extreme moralism, and it lies at the heart of our religious ethos and even our foreign policy. Extreme morality is characterized by the use of language which makes a clear and unambiguous division between good and evil. It is often couched in the language of perpetrators and victims. Perpetrators are evil, victims are good. Guilty, innocent. Good, bad. While this kind of heightened moralism feels satisfying and is appealing to our sense of order and justice, it is a dangerous combination if applied to situations which are more complex and ambiguous. In cases like this, it is likely not only to allow, but perhaps cause more human suffering than it is intended to stop. And this is the great irony of extreme morality. While its intent is to reduce evil in the world, it literally creates enemies and evil. This is not because it makes opposing groups angry or more defiant, but because in order to create an other, it is a psychological tendency, perhaps necessity, to dehumanize or monsterize all groups that are not considered insiders. This process of making enemies is based on recent social scientific studies in the last 10, 15 years that examine the psychology of how people need to dehumanize others before they can justify violence or oppression. And there's no shortage of scholarship that describes how perpetrators of violence dehumanize their victims through the propaganda of fear and intimidation and self-preservation. It is an incredibly effective mechanism that has shown its success over and over again. But aggressors are not the only ones who construct enemies. Defenders of victims engage in the same, yet mostly unexplored process. Evil is constructed by translating political and sociological events into a moral framework that is binary and extreme. There is good and there is evil. The assumption, of course, is that genocide is evil and therefore it must be defeated with good, even if that ironically includes violence. I am not, I repeat, not attempting to state that evil is a purely constructed or subjective idea. There are violent human forces that do prevail, sometimes with stunning and incomprehensible speed and intensity. There are times when it is necessary to meet violence with violence against those who are actively seeking the destruction of human life and dignity. But deciding when that action is required can be problematic, and it is not as effective as we might assume. I believe that we should examine more closely the process by which enemies are created by defenders. It is an attempt to weigh the cost of moral language in the political and social arena. If we assume that our common cause is to reduce violence in the world, not necessarily evil, that's an important distinction, then religious language and absolute categories of good and evil may not be the most effective or expedient way to confront the complexities of a modern pluralistic world. It is at this point where extreme morality breaks down and limits the kinds of choices we make. The work of Mahmoud Mamdani and his uniquely political and African perspective is very helpful here, and has been for me. Mamdani is no fan of religion, and he rarely talks about it. But his concerns are the same as most religious communities, the reduction, perhaps to zero, of human violence. The difference is that Mamdani does not see the world through the eyes of extreme morality. He is not interested in naming one group as evil and the other as good. In fact, he sees this binary labeling as the legacy of colonialism and the church that went with it. I would push even farther to say that human history is marked by this tendency to dehumanize those who are considered outsiders or threats. Does that mean that what happened in Rwanda was natural? Yes, but only insofar as the presence of fear and intimidation play off of this human weakness. My assumption in matters such as these is that any human behavior, no matter how despicable or noble, should be considered natural. If we are capable of doing it, then it is natural. The judging of those behaviors is a different matter entirely. I do not assume that nature is any kind of justification for destructive human behavior. This issue came to life for me in late July of 2008. This was last July. I visited Rwanda with a representative delegation of Villanova faculty, organized and sponsored by Catholic Relief Services. In the course of the trip, I had an opportunity, it seems the wrong word, but nevertheless, to visit the largest prison in Kigali called 1930, because that's the year it was built. And I interviewed 3 prisoners of genocide there. These are perpetrators, by the way. This was a unique opportunity arranged by Catholic Relief Services, and especially my translator, Gloriosa Wimpaway, who not only translated for me and the entire delegation, but taught me more about genocide than I could ever read in a book. She lost her entire family except for one sister who was living in Uganda at the time. She's an amazing individual who now works for the Peace Corps in Rwanda, and it was in the course of that visit, and especially in the wake of the interviews, that I realized that by the time the genocide began, the choice facing Rwandans, Hutu and Tutsi, had more to do with life and death than right and wrong, family or stranger, friend or foe. Something had happened that had transformed genocide into a movement, even a popular movement, that made the killing of one's neighbors thinkable, even compelling. In the decades following the Hutu Revolution of 1959, there were instances of Tutsi violence against Hutu, but for the most part, the fear of Tutsis was methodically constructed. But this distinction between constructed danger and genuine danger makes little difference if one believes that the danger is real. It has the same effect: fear. For all of their brutality, the architects of the genocide knew something profound about human nature. They knew that in order to ensure true complicity, bystanders had to become perpetrators in some form. And fear played a huge role in shaping the identity of both groups. I must clarify here that my language here differs significantly from Mahmoud Mandami, who holds that the key to unlocking the genocide was convincing Hutus that they were native victims fighting against perpetrating settlers, who are the Tutsis. Within this mindset, any actions could be framed as self-defense or protectionism. But these ideas are not incompatible with mine. They work at a different psychological level. In order to become a justified perpetrator of genocide, it was important first to be perceived as a victim. Self-victimization is a psychological mechanism in groups that plan and commit acts of violence against other groups. This is apparent in skinheads and other racist groups who fanaticize about a utopian future and past. The present, however, is characterized by victimization. The state of affairs is used to implement violence as justice, earthly or divine. But there is a deep irony for white supremacists who are convinced that they are the disenfranchised victims. For all their supremacy, they see themselves as losing forces of, quote, inferior, impure, degenerate mongrels. And the undergirding of all this is the fear of impurity and the loss of power and place. The disconnect between being genetically superior and a loser at the same time can be said of Hutu supremacist ideology. The fear is not so much about loss through miscegenation or blood mixing as it is about loss of land, legacy, and life. At the prison, I interviewed a woman who was a reporter for a major MRND, which was a Hutu extremist party in Rwanda at the time, and later worked at the RTLM, which was the Radio Television Libre de Mille Collines, which was the radical Hutu supremacist radio station that broadcast out of Kigali in the run-up to the genocide and through the genocide, which really told people how to conduct the genocide. She was a public figure in Rwanda and known for encouraging Hutu women, particularly, to kill Tutsi women and children. That was kind of her role as a female DJ. She told me that her father was a Hutu extremist, but her mother was Tutsi. And this was not an unusual combination at that time. Yet she grew up convinced that Tutsis wished to kill Hutus and that they were planning to take over the country and instill a Tutsi king to rule over the Hutu and again, as in the times of colonialism, make them their slaves. She believed that all Tutsis were cockroaches threatening to overrun her country. These were powerful myths created and reinforced by extremist groups and forces in Rwanda. But she did not necessarily learn this in school as much as from her Hutu father and the surrounding propaganda. When I pressed her to say whether she thought her mother or her Tutsi peers, she had Tutsi friends in school, to ask her whether they were going to kill her, she said, of course not. She was unable to explore the disconnect between her fear of Tutsis and her own Tutsi mother, who was killed in the genocide. When push came to shove, she and her father identified with the Hutu, and she chose to believe the myth of the Tutsi instead of her own experience of Tutsis. Even though she claimed that she is now reformed and repentant, there was an eerie, distracted coldness when she spoke of her late mother. Gloriosa and I both felt this, and it was chilling. Another inmate, called Muhammad, was a high-level district leader in the MRND against, again, the radical Hutu extremist group that was in power at the time. He told me he had a colleague who did not cooperate with the MRND because he disagreed with the radical and violent direction it was moving. But because of his opposition to the party, he simply disappeared in early 1994. This was the tipping point for Muhammad. From then on, he did his best to cooperate and keep a low profile. As a Muslim, he told me that his faith did not recognize any difference between Hutu and Tutsi. But as the genocide approached, it became clear to him that he and his family were in danger. He told me he had on numerous occasions where he chose not to act or speak on behalf of Tutsi colleagues, and they disappeared. By his account, he lived two lives, one private and religious, the other public and lethal. In both cases, the fear of retribution for non-participation was perceived by him as real. Regardless of whether we judge people for willful ignorance or chosen neglect, fear was the driving factor for all Hutus who remained behind. I must stress here again at this point that I am in no way attempting to remove any sense of personal or political or corporate or social responsibility from the perpetrators or watchers, as I call them, of the genocide. But when one studies perpetrators of extreme violence, there is often confusion between understanding why and exoneration from. This is a natural inclination we have as humans. When we understand motives, we run the risk of empathizing. Many times we do not want to know the brutal, abusive, and tortured past of perpetrators because it might not allow us to demonize them. We do not want to know that perpetrators of the Rwandan genocide truly believe that they were cleansing their land or protecting the future for their children, or that they simply saw an opportunity to gain land, food, or camaraderie with the other killers. It is even dangerous to appreciate that they believe that if they did not kill their Tutsi neighbors, they themselves would be killed for not doing their work, which was the term that Hutu extremists used for the killing. It was called work, and it happened from 9 to 5. It is easier to make them into evil monsters, inhuman and terrifying. This is moral extremism. If we continue to frame extreme human violence in extreme moral language, then we do little, I believe, to prevent further genocides. For the Church and those who see the world in religious terms, the Rwandan genocide presents dangerous questions about who we choose to defend and condemn and how we act on that moral conviction. If we, and by we I mean Americans, because I can only speak as an American, continue to see the world through colonialists' eyes, then we will only see good people and evil people. We will think of ourselves as the saviors whose job it is to eliminate evil, even if it means, quote, draining the tank. With extreme moralism, we run the risk of finding ourselves on the side of leaders, even those who appear to be on the side of good, who may frame their arguments in religious and moral terms such as the axis of evil. And when we allow ourselves to believe that we are God's gift to the world and the rest of the world is either for us or with the terrorists, then we might find ourselves endorsing actions that cause far more destruction of human life than they are intended to save. Since the attacks of 9/11, and especially in the years that followed, the U.S. operated its foreign policy based on a defensive but extreme moralism. This was the foreign policy that has isolated us from the larger world and turned us into occupiers in Iraq and torturers at Guantanamo Bay. In our fragile and shocked state, the categories of good and evil gave us comfort. but it is becoming increasingly clear that this tendency to create enemies is worse than ineffective. It made us blind to the consequences of our and complexities of our actions, and it has made me think twice about how to deal with the danger of extreme human violence. In the case of Sudan, America needs to reconsider what it wants for the people of Sudan. If we continue to see the Sudanese government as a perpetrator of genocide and therefore evil, that's a crucial link, then we cannot engage in any kind of constructive talk. We limit the amount of aid we can give to that country, and we restrict the kinds of actions that are possible. In the States, there are two main lines of thinking regarding Darfur. One believes that we should swoop in and wipe out all the bad guys and save all the good, innocent people. And this thinking is slightly ironic because it comes from groups that traditionally oppose war, yet the force of extreme moral indignation calls for military action in Darfur, as if what failed in Iraq will work wonders in Darfur. The other group thinks that we should let Africans fight it out amongst themselves. These are both colonial attitudes. They are what kept us out of Rwanda in 1994. They sound ridiculous, but they are very much a part of America's ethos, and they are bound up with an extreme morality that only sees the world in terms of good, bad, enemy, ally, military aggression, or willful blindness. It is tempting to conclude that Rwanda's colonial legacy of European supremacist culture and moral absolutism of the church made people vulnerable to moral extremism after the 1959 revolution, and this is what radical Hutu ideology was built on. The idea that Tutsis were dangerous, if not evil, and they needed to be purged from the land permanently. It is tempting to go back and give a hypothetical scenario about how the genocide could have been averted if only we had done X, Y, and Z. But this is not constructive and does not bring the lessons of Rwanda into the future. What the 1994 genocide of the Tutsi and moderate Hutu showed the West, specifically America, was that we have a long way to go in understanding Africa and how its colonial past has shaped its and our sensibilities. I am convinced that answering extremism with extremism will fail in politics because it is based on a flawed understanding of the human spirit. If the goal is only to prevent genocide, then we will fail. We must get ahead of the fire and see ourselves as proactive and preventative. Learning to understand Africa is difficult and requires time and humility. It is very much in the spirit of Mandami's most recent work on the conflict in Sudan called Survivors and Saviors, where he argues, quote, against those who substitute moral certainty for knowledge and who feel virtuous even when acting on the basis of total ignorance. And perhaps the greatest lesson that we can learn from the events of 1994 in Rwanda, that knowledge and compassion for all humanity trumps moral extremism. We must fight this tendency to make enemies only so we can be heroes. Thank you. All right, thank you very much. I would like to invite you to comment, ask questions, if you'd like, just for a few minutes. I won't go too long, I know but does anyone have any reactions or questions that you'd like to ask? Yeah.
We were talking about how the moral extremist view and how there's like good guys and bad guys, and that's one like extreme view, and then the other that you had mentioned was about like just not helping at all.
Right.
And those are two very like kind of black and white views. So in your opinion, what would be some kind of gray area or something that we could do?
That's a very good question. It's a very good question. I actually think that this current administration is moving in the right direction on Darfur. I mean, and what I didn't do is read the whole briefing about the kinds of things that are being done to address this, not waiting until genocide has started. Because if you wait until genocide starts, it's too late. Right. So the kinds of things that we're engaging in now is first bringing attention to that region, right? Making sure that it stays on the map and that people are thinking about it and what's going on there, right? And also talking to the friends of Sudan. And that is a real challenge. I mean, I think the one thing that would change things in Sudan more than anything is if China and Russia were to be on the same page as us. with the kinds of demands that we want the Sudanese government to do, with the kinds of aid that we want, the kind of transparency we want in the government, the kinds of things that the government is doing to address the problem of displaced persons, the kinds of things that the government is doing in order to address the violence that's happening in these camps, the kinds of things that it's doing in order to allow aid groups to get into the country and be transparent about that. You get China and Russia on board, then the Sudanese will listen. But as long as they have China and Russia on their side, then they have a steady stream of money and income and trade partners, and they are not going to hit the Sudanese government where it hurts. That's one of the things I think we underestimate. We tend to think of states like Sudan or failed states or even leaders who look like dictators as having, we kind of apply this idea that they're mad scientists who want to rule the world, and they're loners, and they don't care what anybody thinks, they just want power for power's sake. I think that's part of the flawed understanding. Everybody has friends. Everyone wants to be accepted by their peers. What we don't do a good job is knowing who their peers are. Who's important to al-Bashir? Who is important to Sudan? We tend to think that the only way of dealing with Sudan is either do this or we're going to hit you in the face. And I think that's the sort of mentality that we're moving away from. We're getting more sensitive to kinds of the politics of how we do this. Now, that doesn't mean you let them go on. I think Susan Rice was great. She said, inaction is not progress. We are not going to allow you to just keep the status quo is not going to be acceptable anymore. But the kinds of things that are happening behind closed doors with China and Russia to make sure that they are accountable and that they, but see, the problem with China is that when you make China make Sudan be accountable for their human rights record, and you have to make China accountable for their human rights record. And then we have to be accountable to China because we're very dependent on China, very dependent economically on China. So, and it comes back to us. Eventually all roads will lead back to us. And that's where, if we're not willing to be humble and realize that we're involved in this, very much involved in this, and that we need to make changes as well before we can make claims for other people to do this, then we are not going to get anywhere. But I do think we are moving in the right direction, which I'm very encouraged. Even though this word genocide is in a semantic no man's land right now, where some people are using it and some people are not, which I pointed out in the paper, I think that's fading. And I think in the coming months, people will stop talking about ongoing genocide and they'll talk about a legacy of genocide, which I think is a very productive way to see this. You still have genocide, you still know that bad things happen in the wake of it, but now we're going to move on, move forward. Right? Was there another? That's a good question. Is there another hand that went up? I thought I saw. Yeah, Brendan.
When you talk about moving forward, are you talking about moving away from the use of the term genocide? Is it immediately linked to moral extremism?
I am. It's a bit radical of me, I realize. But my stance on this is I think genocide, if we are always arguing about, and if you hear interviews, all they want to know is do you mean that there's a genocide going on? Are you saying there's an ongoing genocide? Because of the confusion, that's all we talk about, is defining whether or not genocide is happening. I think that slows us up. I think we are latched onto this idea that we'll only intervene in a country, and I don't mean militarily, I mean in any way, only if there's a genocide. That has caused us to be preoccupied with defining genocide. That is why we stood outside of Rwanda and did nothing in the years leading up to genocide. People knew this, people saw this coming. This was not a surprise. The way we describe it in the States was a boiling over of ancient, factions between these rival African tribes that just boiled up spontaneously. It's just not true, right? And so that's what I don't want to do, argue about whether there's genocide or not. Is there something we can do? If so, then why are we not doing it? It is in our best interest to do this. To connect this. So yes, I don't want to talk about whether genocide happened or is happening in Darfur. Why aren't we okay with, there are people dying every day because there's no clean food and water. Millions of people are displaced and living in atrocious conditions, and there is impunity out there. There is no rule of law. And women are being raped and children are being killed and people are dying because of sanitation problems. Is that not enough? So yes, I at this point in my life, I'm saying I don't want to talk about genocide, and yet I teach a course on genocide, which is an irony in and of itself. But for this particular one, I'm good. Yeah, in the back.
You mentioned that you think one of the best ways to help prevent genocide is to go for the powerful friends of the African countries. But how do you get a China or a Russia to go along with it when they're making a lot of money off it, when they're selling?
That is a really tough question. And I think in order for America to be able to say to China, we have to take risks. We have to say Sudan is important to us. And it's so important to us that we are ready to put our trade relationship on the line with you. We're ready to put our diplomatic relationships on the line with you. We're ready to stop talking to you unless you make this as important as it is to us. That's incredibly risky for a government to do because there's so much money involved. And that's where you get this sort of like, how much is it worth to us? And at this point, we're not willing to do this. We're not willing to do this. And I don't think that we should be in the business of making ultimatums to countries. You know, you either do this or we don't trade with you. That's not the way politics are done either. Things move slowly, right? And so I think we have to take risks, and it has to be important to people. And if it stays on the map, and if being America means not watching this happen anymore, and being able to use all of our strengths, not just military, and I actually think military is like the worst way to deal with anything in another country. That is the thing you use when it's too late. But we have a lot of power that we don't really use or utilize. We're not very creative in the way we think about it, or we haven't been. And I think we're getting a better way. But it's a very, very tough question. This is what your generation is going to work out. How important is this to you? My generation, we're struggling to change. We're struggling to keep up. Your generation is going to be the one that defines how America is in the world and what kind of things define us as Americans. Really, that's the central question about what it is. And if it's all about money, then we're going to just sit and wait for Sudan to get so bad that it's just so terrible what goes on in Africa. You know, that's what's going to happen again. And it will happen again. I guarantee you. So it's kind of depressing, but it's not in a way, because I think the flip side of what I'm talking about is that there are ways you can't, if you educate yourself, if you learn to take the time and humility to learn about these things and what's going on, then you can do things early on and see things that are happening that you can change instead of waiting until people start chopping each other up with machetes, which you can do very little about once that happens. 100 days, 1 million people. There's not much you can do in that amount of time, right? That's too late. So I'm trying to see what we can learn from that to kind of bring that forward so it doesn't happen again, right, on any level. It's a good question, though. Yeah?
So what can be done within this country, say, a country in a situation like Rwanda, where you have this kind of pervasive culture of fear? What do you think can be done to kind of dispel that fear before it starts to cause violence on such a huge scale?
Well, in the case of Rwanda, it's too late, and now we're in cleanup, and transparency is. But there are other places in the world where there are things that are going on where there are cultures of fear being built, and I think the best antidote to that is transparency, and I actually think the most powerful thing we have is actually the media, to bring to light things that happen in countries that are designed to fear and intimidate people. For example, in my class in Genocide, we're tracking this story that happened in Guinea about 3 weeks ago, where a group of women were brutally raped and mutilated in public at a peaceful demonstration against the Guinean government. And some soldiers just absolutely tore into them. And it was horrific. That is an act that is designed to instill fear in the population. It is designed to make women, in particular, shut up, right? Now, that's early. It's not a genocide happening in Guinea. But these are the kinds of things that happen, and that if they are not addressed, if those soldiers are not punished, if people in Guinea believe that nobody cares and that there is a culture of impunity and that people can do things like that without any repercussions for them at all, then you start mixing up a batch of genocide. Because then you create fear and you create silence and you create a part of impunity. And that's the other thing that comes after fear, is impunity, where people believe they can do anything without being punished. And once you allow that, then that's where you get into dangerous ground. So those are ways, again, and that's why we're tracking that in this class, because it first came out in this allafrica.com, which is a culling of all the African newspapers. And I picked it up because I'm paying attention to it and sent it to my students. 7 days later, it came up on NPR. Today, there was another story about the interviewing the women that were involved in this, and they're speaking out. They are not being quiet. and they are starting to call for justice for these soldiers, and they're not going to let them off the hook. As long as that stays in the media, as long as that and people pay attention to that and put pressure on the Guinean government to bring these soldiers to justice, then that is the kind of thing that will prevent genocide. Right there, small things. If you just write it off and say, wow, those Africans, they are a brutal people, then you are contributing to a future genocide. That's what you can do as Americans, is to make sure that you keep stories like that in the forefront, that you make sure that these things do not just fly off the map. Early warning signals. That's why the study of genocide is so important, because when you learn the patterns of how a genocide is built and what are the triggers that prepare the ground for genocide, once you learn those, then you can start seeing, and you see little hot spots all over the globe. It's not like you see genocide everywhere, but you see where are points of concern, and then you go there and you address it. So this is an unfinished story. I don't know what's going to happen to these soldiers yet. I hope something happens to them before the end of the term, because I'd like to show my class that you can stop genocides from happening, but I don't know. I honestly don't. I'm just kind of watching, and I wrote to NPR, and I said, thank you for this story. Keep the heat on this story. Keep this out there. Keep pressuring it. Because this will make a difference. Any other questions? Well, thank you. Yeah, bless you. Yeah, thank you very much for coming tonight. I really, really appreciate you coming. This is a very heartening thing to see at Villanova. So, thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and just on behalf of STAND, I'm Genocide Awareness Week Chair. I just want to thank Dr. Horner for coming out tonight and giving this excellent lecture to all of us. And if we have shirts on sale in the corner, if you'd like to come buy some shirts, and there's like some extra cookies left as well. But thanks for coming. If you enjoyed.
Eat the food.
Eat the food.
The food.